Hello, everyone. I'm David Cuff, the executive editor of Occupational Health and Safety magazine. Welcome to today's executive Q&A webinar, Rethinking Occupational Health Management for Smarter, More Responsive Care. Today's webinar is brought to us by Examinetics. Many thanks to them for making today's presentation possible. I'm eager to dive into today's program, given that many occupational health programs need to develop worker health delivery models that support compliance and injury response and workforce needs across multiple locations, shifts, and scenarios. That's not exactly an easy scenario. It's fortunate that we have two really solid experts today who are going to kind of help us parse out the solutions to that challenge. I'm talking about Mike Pelz, Vice President of Health and Safety Solutions for Examinetics, and Matt Kafer, Director of Technology Development for Examinetics. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Mike Pelz joined the Examinetics team in 2024 with the acquisition of OneSource, where he was Vice President of Operations. His primary responsibilities include the oversight of sales and program development. Mike has more than 30 years industry experience in occupational health and safety. Including clients, and he helps clients implement safety programs that are efficient and effective and fully compliant. He has a BS of Industrial Engineering from the Illinois State University. And then Matt Kafer, again, is the Director of Technology Development at Examinetics, where he leads cross-functional teams in designing and delivering innovative solutions that enhance occupational health services. With more than 15 years of experience in the mobile medical and dental industry, and the last 7 focused on occupational health, Matt's driven numerous technology initiatives spanning both internal and client-facing platforms. He led the development of the Solix technology, overseeing everything from hardware engineering and acoustic testing to regulatory compliance and mobile app integration. Beyond Solix, he has spearheaded the creation of advanced data capture tools that modernize field operations and streamline the delivery, of health services nationwide. So Mike and Matt, welcome to the program, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, David.
Well, it's great to have you here. Before we dive in, let me go through a few housekeeping items. As everybody probably saw when you registered for this webinar, this is part of our executive Q&A program. So in this type of webinar, we're really trying to devote a large portion of the program to answering your questions about today's topic so that you can get some direct insights from Mike and Matt and tap into their expertise. So I always say, consider this a little bit like open office hours with the professor. And so you can submit questions and then we'll post them to Mike and Matt. If you'd like to submit a question, you're more than welcome to use the Ask a Question console on your screen. And you can do that at any point during the webinar. To give us a little structure, I do have some interview questions for Mike and Matt on some timely topics related to today's discussion. But again, we really want to kind of dedicate our time to answering your questions. If you have any technical difficulties during the presentation, click on the help button located below the slide window and you'll receive technical assistance. Lastly, after this virtual event, you're going to receive an email containing a link to an archive of today's webinar so you can go back and view it, maybe share it with a colleague who might have missed it. Okay, so now we're ready to kick things off. You guys ready to go?
We're ready.
Okay, let's do it. So let's kick things off by talking about how and why traditional occupational health models are being stretched. Obviously, I think traditional approaches are not necessarily applying to current workplace challenges. So first question for you, what pressures or changes are you seeing that make traditional occupational health programs harder to manage?
Mike, do you want to lead off and I'll kind of follow up?
Perfect. Thank you, Matt.
I would say there's a few that really come into play, and not that economics wasn't always a main factor in companies carrying out their workers' comp and OCMED programs, but I think it's even more so nowadays, especially because of the fact that you have higher turnover rates. You don't have that longevity of employees at a company like you used to. So whether it be through your regulatory compliance program or how do you assess employees, the economics are more stringent now than they are ever before. And I think that that is something that a lot of companies have had to really look at, is really balancing that act between maintaining compliance standards, but also doing it in a manner that's very cost effective. The other part of it is that when you look at it from an operational standpoint, it has been proven through the years that a lot of companies are more cost effective when they have maybe even going to running 3 shifts 4 days a week than 5 shifts 2 days a week, and getting very similar productivity. So because of that, now you have employees that are working extended hours during the course of the day, which obviously has changed operational standards. Or you'll even see where you've got companies who are shutting down facilities and consolidating them down to fewer facilities operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And for those of you who have been in the industry segment for a long time, you know that servicing employees after hours and weekends can be very difficult. So that's been a contributing factor. And then the last one, before I hand off to Matt on the technology side of things, is where companies are locating. I mean, we're seeing that more and more, where companies are moving out of the traditional environments of operating their business. You're seeing people like Mercedes-Benz, who opened up a facility down in Arkansas. You're seeing a lot of companies moving into more rural areas because the cost of labor is less expensive. They're getting phenomenal tax breaks by these different counties that they're operating in. So now, instead of being in Chicago or Los Angeles or these big areas where you have enough capabilities to support those operations, you're now in a very rural area. So now to support your needs isn't always the easiest. And those are three of the main factors that I've seen that are really starting to contribute to a different environment for workers' comp and OCMED. And I know, Matt, you've got some different thoughts on the technology side of things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the three things that you mentioned are sort of like the catalysts, and then the technology and the process is kind of what holds those things together and creates pressure, right? If you didn't have those things changing, then maybe your traditional model of, I'm going to send my folks off to the local clinic and get their testing done, they're going to bring all their papers back. That probably still works. Could it be improved from an efficiency standpoint? Probably so. But when you put in those other constraints of 24-hour ops, I might need to have stat needs addressed at 3 o'clock in the morning, or maybe just my annual testing done. A lot of times the technologies that we use, whether it's how we do our record keeping, how we do our communication, those things just don't really work. They're not flexible enough to be able to accommodate that. And especially when you start reaching out for other solutions to address those needs. Well, now I've got some testing happening over here. I'm doing some of my testing another way. How do I stitch this stuff all together? And maybe your medical system doesn't handle it. And a lot of it is also just, is my process easy to follow, right? And we talk a lot about technology-enabled processes. I think in general, the OC Health, OCMED sphere is sort of, look, I don't want to cast any aspersions, but we're kind of late adopters of stuff. We don't move as quickly into new technology, partially because of sensitivity of what we're dealing with and the criticality of it, but also just there's not a lot of marketing towards it. So you have an older process with an older technology solution, and you're trying to really flex it in all these new ways that Mike mentioned, and I think that causes some real problems.
So let's talk about sort of that older approach. And I think a lot of companies rely on just one delivery model when it comes to occupational health. Where do safety leaders run into problems when they rely on just a sole model?
I think it's flexibility.
Mm.
If you only have one way to get something done, you're really boxed in, right? And having the flexibility for, you know, maybe the outcome is the same, but the process with which you handle medical surveillance for your first shift, maybe the process really needs to be different for your third shift, right?
Hmm.
Or how do you handle injuries on first shift versus third shift? Are those different? It kind of depends for each person, but if you only have one way of getting things done, you just don't have the flexibility to adapt to these things that Mike was mentioning. Mike, I kind of jumped in there. What are your thoughts on
No,
it?
you hit it right on the head, and I think the other part is that where companies have struggled with is they're trying to get consistency, especially when they have multiple locations, and what they're finding out more and more is just because one delivery method or one approach works at one facility doesn't mean they're going to fit at every
Absolutely.
one, whether it be location or head count or exposures or needs. Companies are trying to create consistency within a very inconsistent environment, and I think that's where they're looking to resources. And when you look at what Matt developed on the Salix side of things with the audio testing and the quantitative fit testing, that is the entire approach to some of these aspects are around what can providers like us do to partner with client companies, understanding these nuances and their position and environment to create consistency within an inconsistent environment. I think that's really the goal for every company, is to achieve that as best as possible.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk about injury response. It's one of the hardest parts of occupational health to standardize. Why is that?
It's amazing that, I've been involved, like you mentioned, David, for 30 years doing this. And my first 10 years was on the safety side of things. And, I kind of looked at it through one lens. And now that I've been on the other side for 20 years, it's amazing the education I've received. Timing and employee satisfaction is everything in injury response. Unfortunately, for a lot of employees, they don't always feel like the companies are looking out for their best interest, even though they are, because sometimes their programs are just not in sync with what the needs are.
Hmm.
So when you look at that employee who's on third shift, a lot of times those third shift employees don't feel like they get the same level of care because they're not getting that personalized treatment. You have some people who are working in very remote areas where, maybe your only access point are things like the emergency room versus going to more of a dedicated Occumed clinic, or even the ability to talk to a medical professional for something even fairly minor where they're only getting directive from their supervisor or their safety professional. So the idea is that if a program is well constructed and it really provides instant medical attention to the employees in a manner where the employees feel like the employer is looking out for them, it makes all the difference in the world. And that's even some of the things that we've seen over the last 10 years, is the importance of even doing little things like providing translation services. We're fortunate that we get to do our injury management program all over the world. And, we made the investment into translation services in over 200 languages. So every single employee can communicate in their native language. We have gotten such a feedback on the experience they had by making those efforts to make them comfortable through the process. So if you look at having people who understand the employee's position, understanding the need of protecting the employer, because we don't want them to negatively be impacted by these injuries, give them timely response in a manner that everybody do, that's when you get the win-win situation. And really, when you see the impact that'll have on companies, whether it be reducing your OSHA recordable incidents and lowering not only your experience modification rate, but your DART rate and your TRIR and just your overall costs. But then you add in employee satisfaction, which means that you're probably going to have a higher level of retention. That's where your impact comes in. And that's always got to be the approach for every employer out there, is how do you find that balance?
Fair enough. Fair enough. In the run up to this conversation, I think we talked about how people sort of think about occupational health. And I think there's sort of a I don't want to say there's a checkbox mentality, but there's a sort of like, okay, we figured it out, we're done. Whereas we were talking about how maybe how people need to approach this is that occupational health should be thought about as a continuum rather than a single approach. How does changing that frame of mind change how leaders should plan and prioritize occupational health?
Can I tee you up, Mike?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I mean, we say continuum, so what do we mean by that? In our conversations, we've seen the evolution from, well, I've got to do my annual hearing testing, I need to do my medical clearances and respirator fit testing, and really looking at those things as just individual. I think maybe I see where you're going, checkbox, maybe kind of a little bit pejorative, but these are individual things that I do, right?
Yeah.
But then the shift to, look, there's really a full life cycle of an employee, right? And it starts maybe even before I issue an offer. There's the pre-employment side of things that flows into any sort of post-offer that you need to do. And if you think about it, kind of calling back to the injury thing, the employee satisfaction and trust, think about it from the employee's point of view, is they're not doing these little quantized events. They're living their life. They came to work at a company and they go through the whole continuum, right? From pre-employment to your annual screenings, to how you handle injuries, to offboarding and that sort of thing. So when we say continuum, we're kind of thinking about that whole life cycle. How many different departments within the company that touches, right? It's HR, it's talent acquisition, it's safety, and then also the layer above it of, you've got the things that you do. Well, how about the policies that you create, based on your industrial hygiene work, that drive some of those things? So hopefully I didn't babble too long on that, Mike, and maybe that teed you up pretty well. But that's just kind of the conversation we have.
It is, and that's right on the money. And when you start looking at things from that approach, Matt, the other part that you start looking at is the correlation of the events within that life cycle. And a perfect example is that when you start working with a company and you start discussing and putting together a plan to better manage their work-related injuries. And, so often I'm provided an opportunity to evaluate a lot of the clients' last 3 years loss run data. And it's always amazing to me when I start evaluating that and I start saying, I'm like, you guys had 32 of almost the exact same injuries in the last year doing, according to the information, a very similar essential function. I go, have you guys ever looked at why that's happening, whether it be from an ergonomic standpoint to help prevent that from happening, or is it just such a rigorous essential function with some, significant physical requirements? Are you using a proper, pre-employment process to make sure that the candidates you're screening actually have the physical ability to do these jobs? And you start doing these correlations where what you do for your pre-employment can directly impact your work-related injuries and vice versa. You start looking at, so many of our client companies over the years have stressed that how frustrated they get when employees who are coming back from a personal leave are sustaining an aggravation of that pre-existing condition within the first 30 or 60 days. And now they own that work-related injury, and how to implement things like a return to duty program, or even how to effectively implement things like drug and alcohol to really create a culture of a drug and alcohol-free workplace because of all the positive benefits. So I think the companies that have had the most success overall with their workers' comp and occ med programs are not looking at things in silos anymore. They're looking at that cause and effect. And to Matt's point is, yeah, maybe that initial trigger might be that initial exam done for new hires, but it even goes back a step further than that, like he had mentioned, when it comes to doing things like IH monitoring, understanding the exposures they have. Do they need to be part of a hearing conservation program? what are the Pell limits that they're exposed to? What kind of a respirator do they need to be exposed to? These all tie together from start to finish. And I think the real successful companies I've had an opportunity to work with in my career don't look at things in an isolation. And I think that's a real key point.
It's hard, Mike. You listed all those things off, and I just think that's pretty overwhelming. I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to solve those things, maybe one thing at a time, but at some point you have to have a holistic view of it, overwhelming as it is.
I agree.
All right, well, let's dive into some audience questions. We've got some good ones. You guys mentioned economics as a player in moving away from traditional approaches. Do you find that companies are more or less likely to spend money on safety? And what are the strategies you've used to get leadership buy-in?
That's a good question. When you look at safety, you kind of have to look at what are the bookends of safety. And within that being said is that when we typically look at a lot of different aspects of implementing different safety programs, to what Matt brought up originally on the IH side of things, to me, I like the idea of spending time and money on doing proper IH work on the front end to know what the exposures are. Because you would be shocked at how many clients I've worked with over the years who have these elaborate physical profiles for pre-employment and periodic, and they're doing, $300-400 worth of lab work because that's what they've always done. They don't always know what the exposures are, and those are recurring costs year over year versus doing one IH survey for $5,000 or $6,000. And all of a sudden you realize that 60% of your employee base, it doesn't even have these exposures, so you can eliminate them from your medical compliance program. And now you look at what that return on investment is. And when you do find that you do have, a situation where your people are now required to be part of a hearing conservation program, that's when, getting people like Matt involved to understanding technology. Now you're not just using the old-fashioned always going to the clinic for an audio test. You have the availability of, do I work with a partner that provides mobile testing with a mobile unit that comes out that can test multiple people at one time, or even the Salix, which is a self-administrator from a flexibility. Because when you look at the dollars you invest in your safety program, it's not only not to look at the prevention of costs and to keep people safe, it's also, can you implement parts of the program which also reduces operational impact as well, which means employees aren't having to leave the job site for different testing, meaning that they don't have to go to a clinic, drive there, get tested, come back. Now you might have lost 2 hours of operational efficiencies, which is revenue out of the company's pockets. So when we typically will work with our client companies to invest in safety, it's around the impact of the operations and be able to do the analytics about what the return on investment is going to be. Because I guarantee you, when you do it right on the front end, there is a return on that investment. And that's always been our approach. And Matt, I'd like to know your thoughts.
Yeah, that's where I was going with it, Mike, that specifically about the leadership buy-in. I don't think you can just compare the invoice price of the services. And it takes a little time. But if you try to quantify what sort of savings or increased revenue from the operational efficiency you gain by implementing some sort of different delivery methods, I think that's really the tack you need to take as far as leadership buy-in goes, right? Sure, you might be spending more or the same on invoices to vendors for your health and safety services. But if you're able to show even a 5% increase, in productivity or efficiency, I guess, hours lost out of the day, then that's really speaking the language, and you can get buy-in in that fashion. But that's really the only thing I wanted to kind of highlight. I think you covered everything else pretty well.
Perfect. All right. Here's another good one, and that is pretty straightforward. Are there common signs that an occupational health program doesn't fit our workplace or no longer fits our workplace or the work that we're doing? Are there telltale signs that maybe they need to rethink?
Yeah, I think And Mike, I'll let you go because you work a lot, directly with clients on implementing this stuff. But I think one is if you're trying to do a one size fits all, right? This kind of goes back to the flexibility requirements. The procedures and policies that you put in place for a 25-person location that only works during the day probably don't fit as well for a 300-person location that works 24/7, right? And if you just really don't have any solution for the disruptions that implementing this program causes, I think those are sort of the big things, right? If you don't have an answer to the ops manager of, yeah, every year we need to shut down the lines for half a day, or we're pulling people off for 4 hours. I'm not saying that you won't stop doing that, but at least being able to present the options of we can do it this way or that way. That's kind of a red flag to me that you've got kind of an inflexible system.
And to kind of play off that, Matt, one of the things that I always say is that I typically know when the program is no longer operating at the point where it needs to is when you have those peripheral departments getting involved. It means that finance is now involved and HR is now involved and your plant manager and operations are involved. Because, typically, we're working very heavily with, talent acquisition, we're dealing with safety, we're working with risk management. But when you have the operations side of things saying we are losing too much productivity time becoming, staying compliant, that's a problem. When you have finance saying, why is this program costing us 3 times more than it did just 2 years ago? When HR comes, why are we having so much, employee turnover? When those departments start having a voice in your regulatory compliance, in your injury management program, your program is no longer effective. And that has been the catalyst 9 times out of 10 with me, is those are the people that are typically in those initial meetings and they want to know the why and how do we solve it for our current environment and structure. And that's what I always look for, is that involvement.
Okay, well, that leads us to another question, because I think, now we're getting kind of to the kernel here, is talking about sort of, aligning health programs and real world ops. Where do you see misalignments between compliance requirements and day-to-day operations that might cue the sorts of things that you've just described?
I think you have to remember when it comes to medical compliance in a lot of different areas, it's kind of a moving target. And I know, Matt had to get very involved in, on the audio side of things. He had to get involved in on the respirator fit testing side. There's a lot of regulatory standards that change on a fairly regular basis. And then it's the understanding of it, whether it comes to companies that have to be compliant with DOT regulations and the differences between FMCSA and PHMSA and FRA. And, what is the difference between a hazmat exam versus a HAZWOPER? Or you've got the new silica standard and there's variations between the silica standard and OSHA versus MSHA. You have all these different standards. And then the problem you run into is there's the standards that come about from the federal guidelines, but then there are basic medical guidelines that are not privy to these employers. And the problem you run into is that in order for a company to have that level of subject matter expertise, whether it be the clinical side of things that you would get from a treating physician versus somebody on the safety side versus the IH side, or even with, the stuff that Matt has to deal with on a daily basis, that there's state regulations. Some audio testing in certain states have to have, a KOC certified, technician doing it. Or now with the new silica standard, you can't just get a PFT. You have to get a PFT with a NIOSH certified tech. This is very complex and it's constantly changing. And this is where I personally see a lot of times where there's this big gap between HR and safety, because they're both looking at both sides of the programs and neither one of them are wrong. But the problem is they don't always line up. And when you have a good partner who can kind of wean through this to really help you determine what is the difference between the wants versus the needs, You've got to focus on the needs because those are a requirement. And you then get a better understanding is if you do implement wants, it needs to be implemented with the understanding that it is going to provide you some kind of a return on investment. And I
Yeah,
think
think about the business size too, Mike. You mentioned conflict, or not conflict, but a misalignment between HR and safety. If you're a small and medium-sized business, that might be the same person.
Yes.
Maybe not so much HR and safety, but especially like on the operation side, you've got a guy that manages the floor and he's also in charge of health and safety, and he's deeply internally conflicted. Do I keep my productivity up, or do I spend the time reviewing these policies and making sure that they're in line, or I really don't want to shut down this production line for testing? So even aside from maybe the internal conflict of what do I want to do, there's only so many hours in the day, right? People have a business to run, and if you're maybe less than a 50-person operation, maybe less than 100, you're wearing a lot of different hats, and you got to find a way to get all those things done. And I think a lot of times, unfortunately, it falls to, I'm going to keep the gears turning, keep the business running.
Okay, so we talked about flexibility and productivity. How does flexibility in health delivery actually support productivity rather than disrupt it?
Man, I think this is your sweet spot, so I'm going to hand it off.
Look, flexibility, I think, is everything when it comes to keeping up your productivity. We talked about the different schedules. If you have the flexibility to pick between sending folks to a clinic when it makes sense, bringing a mobile unit on site to get a bunch of people tested when it makes sense, getting one of these on-demand solutions in your office or conference room to test people one at a time when it makes sense, then really all of the decisions are yours, right? You can choose, look, I've got to do some maintenance on a line. I know it's coming up. Let me schedule a larger testing event where I know I can bring those people off, right? Or you can set up a structure where you're not going to shut down one of your lines for any long period of time because you're just going to grab people and test them on their anniversary date, right? So you've got that as far as how do I do my sort of recurring testing, right? Additionally, you have multiple different tools in the toolbox for your stat needs, right? Thinking about injury specifically, I always go to the night shift example for injury, right? If you had a stat need for injury, and maybe that included the need for, say, an alcohol screening, not too distant past, you would have an employee sitting in a conference room for 3 hours while the collector showed up, right? Whereas if you've got on-demand solutions for this, you can do teletriage over the phone, you can do an instant drug and alcohol test, and that person isn't sitting around with an injury wondering what's going to happen. They get their care quickly, but also you're able to get things back moving without having somebody sit there for 3 hours. So it's really just about going back to my one-size-fits-all comment earlier. People want to run their shops differently. Different areas of your business need to operate differently. And if you have access to these different delivery models, then you get to pick what really makes the most sense. Mike, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, but that's really where I go with it.
And it is. And I think, I know you and I have talked several times, it's the Netflix comparison. Companies want it when they want it, how they want it, where they want it. And that's really, I think, the model that most companies are going to or trying to identify, is because then that fits within their model. Right now, I think for the longest period of time when it came to, areas of workers' comp and OcMed, most companies were forced to fit into a box that mostly that OcMed clinic provided. And you didn't have any choice. The clinic was open from 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. So guess what? Even if that, you had somebody working third shift, They still needed that compliance exam every year. Guess what? You were paying them during their off time to go in and get this done. And I think that's the difference now is that, you know, companies that have evolved to support this industry segment are no longer saying you client company are going to fit in our box and that's how it's going to work. It's more of having people like us understanding every aspect of your business to develop a solution completely catered to your work environment is really a must. And those are going to give those companies an advantage in the marketplace, because as you create more cost-effective approaches that minimize loss of productivity, it's going to give those employers a competitive advantage to grow their businesses. And that's really what it's all about.
And it's usually not just one solution, right? You know, back to one size doesn't fit all, but having the ability to pick from these different things where it makes sense, that's really the unlock, right? It's not, I'm just going to pick this one way of doing things because it fits most. Maybe I can cover the 80% with it, but if I have the flexibility to then pick a different solution for the other 20%, outstanding.
Exactly.
Awesome. That answers my next question. So I'm going to skip to a really good audience question. This one's for Mike. Mike, why is it so hard to find a provider or to explain to them about OSHA's definition of first aid and how it can work in medicine to benefit the employee and lower worker comp issues for both the employer and the employee?
So when it comes to that, I see two different sides of it. One of it is that you have less true providers who really dedicate their time to injury management. And this is not only understanding the OSHA regulations, but also the MSHA regulations. What are the associated treatment plans that will keep something under the first aid umbrella versus a recordable event? And this is very important to understand. I mean, we're very fortunate. We manage about 8,500 clinics wide as part of our network. And the education we have to provide a lot of these providers is pretty substantial. I'll tell you, most of them have phenomenal clinical capabilities. They're excellent practitioners. They know how to treat, but what they don't always understand are the little nuances that employers deal with when a doctor will prescribe 800 milligrams of ibuprofen versus 400 milligrams of ibuprofen over the counter, or how they will just listen to the employee who says, you know, doc, I think I'll feel a lot better if I have 2 days off, versus the fact that that's not only is it not in the employee's best interest, but it's sure not in the employer's best interest. And because they've always been trained, listen to the patient, take care of the patient, which is obviously a very important aspect, but you also have to do it through the lens of understanding that the process has to be fair and complete. So it's very important to understand that people that come from safety, people who come from risk management, medical practitioners don't want to listen to people like us. Trust me, I've been through it. But you have a partner in your process. You have a medical partner who can interact. If an injury goes above and beyond, say something like teletriage, and it needs to go to the clinic, and now you have somebody on your side to have those peer-to-peer conversations and having the assistance to the facilities to understand not only the foundational elements of what is this employee's job descriptions, what are their essential functions, the frequency in which they perform them, looking at how much time is left on their shift, their next scheduled workday, plus even discussing potential plans of care that don't limit the level of care that the employee gets, but it's being presented in a way that it doesn't impact the employer. That's the key. And that's the level of interaction you need to get these clinics to perform consistently and fairly within that balance between employee care and taking care of the employer. And to me, that's a big part of it. And the other part of it that comes into play is we no longer have medical practices in this country. They are all medical businesses. And unfortunately, a lot of the decisions that are made at the clinic level are about capitalizing on the revenue per employee, even as simply as diagnosing in a different ICD-10 code, because then there's different treatment plans that are available to them. You need somebody who's going to keep those things in check, where somebody doesn't go in for the sprained finger and they, on the very first visit, they order 6 visits of physical therapy versus looking at a home exercise program. You have to be able to somehow counter that business aspect of it, so that that revenue for the clinic isn't negatively impacting your business. And that's something that's very important as well.
Okay, you mentioned a lens, so I'm going to continue that metaphor. Let's help folks kind of visualize a continuum-based occupational health model. When we talk about that, something that provides a spectrum of delivery options, what does that actually look like in day-to-day operations?
Mike, I'll give I'll give sort of the how we think about the definitions, and then maybe you can expand on implementation. I'll use our terminology. That's what I'm familiar with. I think of the continuum as really on-site. So that is mobile unit testing. A truck or a mobile unit's going to show up for a day, 2 days, a week, and you're testing a lot of folks as quickly as you can, right? So you've got on-site. We think about near-site. So that is the local OCMED clinic. And then we think about on-demand. And so those are usually able to be shipped to you. They're self-administered solutions, the Salix audiometer, on-demand quantitative fit testing, alcohol screens, that sort of thing. So that's sort of the continuum I think of is on-site, mobile unit, near-site, clinic, on-demand, do it yourself how you want to do it. Mike?
Yeah, and thanks, Matt. So, and when you look at those three delivery methods, then you start looking at how they can be most effectively applied, not only to each individual facility, again, based off of location, head count, shift schedule, but also service type, meaning that, it's very hard to justify mobile unit for pre-employment just because unless you're doing a mass hiring, you kind of have these people trickling in, which means that your clinic-based model or possibly the on-demand, if you do more of a subscription, becomes very effective. When you start looking at things like your annual recertifications as part of your medical compliance, that's when I think a good partner to companies will really help you through that process, where not only are they looking at the analytics of what is the cost per employee to test at a clinic versus self-administrated versus on-site, but also helping to calculate what are the expectations from productivity loss. And we just saw this recently for a client who was very set that they wanted to do their silica testing at the clinic level. And the problem is with where they were located, the NIOSH NIOSH certified tech to be compliant with that was about an hour and 15 minutes away. And they had 15 people that were part of it. And they were set that mobile unit was going to be too expensive. But when they started thinking about an hour and 15-minute drive there, an hour and 15-minute drive back, plus, the time it took to be there, and you started taking that into account with your productivity loss, honestly, the mobile unit became a much better solution with a much higher return on investment. So these things can work in conjunction, just like Matt's done a phenomenal job working with our clients to look at how to interact the Salix solution as an after test when people miss the mobile unit or they need retesting after the mobile unit. So then you start getting really creative in how you compare these delivery methods together. And that's where you start getting some real force behind your program, and it becomes extremely effective.
Okay, so clinics, on-site services, and on-demand, we want to combine those. How do you combine those options in a way that's going to feel to everybody in the workplace as intentional rather than sort of fragmented?
I'm the technology guy here, but you got to talk about the data, right?
Okay, all right.
I think it's under the surface, but it's a big part of it, right? If I'm doing let's just even focus on just your annual compliance testing. If I'm doing that through a couple of different delivery methods, then if I don't think about data at all, I might have a mobile provider come and do some testing, and maybe they warehouse my data for me. Maybe they give me a portal that I can look at it, or maybe they give me a file back. And then I don't live in a utopia, so when the mobile unit came, there were definitely people that were absent or on LOA. So, you know, I'm moving ahead of things. I'm looking at different delivery models. I'm going to send them to the clinic. All right, so now I send 5 folks to the clinic. They come back and they show up with their packet of paper, right? Well, now I've got my data in my mobile provider's portal, but I got this packet of data of results in my hand. How do I get these two married up, right? There's solutions for all this, but it sort of becomes more and more of a headache, right? So if you can find a way, whether it's working with a provider that offers sort of all of these different solutions with a unified data model, or finding some technology solution that lets you easily pull this stuff in, then it all goes to one place. And how that manifests itself to the employee is things are predictable, right? We're not forgetting about people's compliance dates because we didn't have their data in the same system where I'm looking at alerts. Oh, you tested at the clinic last year, so I forgot your compliance data is coming up, and now you've got to rush to go back to the clinic, that sort of thing. So I really think having your centralized data management solution, whether it be, you know, with the provider like us, or whether it's something that you administer yourself, I really think that's key in keeping things organized. You know, Mike, I don't know what you have as far as thoughts of operationally, what that continuum looks like, how to keep it together and make it seem holistic.
Yeah, and I think you hit about 90% of it with the data management, because that is the critical aspect for most employers is the convenience of having all your data in a single location. But the secondary part of that I've seen through the years is the amount of work and time you put on the front end for your program development. And what that will entail is very important, because if you do have a provider or a partner that can really administrate all the delivery methods, what's key right away from the get-go is, one, it doesn't matter if your employee had an experience on a mobile unit one year, the on-demand solution the next year, and the clinic the next year. Everything's being done at the same standard and under the same principal guidelines that a company will oversee. So that's important, because we don't want them to see that one delivery method is more or less than one of the other ones. But then you start even getting into the next part of it, which is developing the process flow, where, you know, often I've worked with companies, and I know Matt has as well, where, okay, if you have this type of headcount, it falls into using the mobile unit platform. This one here fits into the on-demand. Or, you know, one thing that I thought was one of the more actually fun projects I worked on was, we had a client that did almost all their periodic testing on the mobile units. And then, depending on their mobile unit mistests or retests, if it was an account of X or higher, then it automatically triggered the on-demand solution being sent out to that facility. If it was X or lower, then it automatically went to clinical services or clinic. So you talk about how do you bring this under one program so it's in sync. A lot of it's that due diligence you do on the front end to not only develop the program, how it flows, but then working with Matt and his team to make sure that data is gathered and distributed exactly the way you want to. And now you have a synergistic program.
Okay, all right. So now, Matt, we were talking about technology, so my appetite is whetted here to talk about technology more. But I want to ask one more question. Before I do, I just want to remind everybody out in the audience, if you've got questions, please use the Ask a Question console to address them. All right, here's the next question I want to ask before we get into a little bit more on technology, and that's this. What are realistic first steps that organizations can take to move towards a continuum-based model without overhauling their entire health program?
Mike, you do this every day. Take it away.
Yeah, you know, a lot of it is really identifying. You know, let's just say that we have you are a company and you have 10 different locations. You really got to get to the grassroots of what are, again, the needs and the wants, what are required at those 10 locations. You have to start identifying that. Do I even need to do anything? Is there a requirement, or are there things that we want to do? You've got to really hash that out. Now, part of that is, you know, do you even have the data to make those determinations? But I always think it's always important to understand, okay, here are my employee classifications. I have DOT, I have DOT employees that are CDL. I've got some that are non-CDL. Well, what are the difference? Well, even though they all have to have DOT physicals and all of them have to have, their DOT file, well, CDL have to be part of a random drug screen program. They have to be able to get post-accident drug and alcohol for citationable events. You got to understand those parameters per employee count so that you understand that per facility. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of times companies, don't always have the time and resources to do that. We saw that, not too many years ago, that we had one client that was putting every single one of their employees through a hazmat exam. Why? Because they didn't really have the resource to determine who needed to be part of it and who didn't need to be a part of it based off of their work problems. Well, when we came in and assisted with them, we probably reduced their regulatory compliance costs by about 35% because that's how many people didn't need to be part of the program. So I think it's that hard evaluation of understanding the environment, the work environment, your employee classifications, what is required per employee classification, and then, what are the wants? And then when you start looking at, okay, locations, head counts, shift schedules, you start adding those components. Now, not only do you know what the program needs to consist of, but then what service delivery options are available to you and which are going to be the most cost effective.
Okay. All right. So now going over to technology, Matt, some points that you made earlier are making me think that technology might be the real glue here when it comes to ensuring sort of the consistency and the visibility and the flexibility that's required by this continuum-based approach. How is technology changing the way that health services are coordinated and delivered? Maybe that'd be a good place to start here.
Yeah, I think it's primarily changed really in two aspects. One, and probably the most obvious, is over the last, 7 to 10 years, our technology has improved enough that within the last couple of years, we can actually enable entirely brand new methods of doing the testing, right? I'm talking about on demand. People were taking audiometers and testing people in conference rooms before, but it really it wasn't tractable for most, right? So the technology improvements that have let us have something that you can get shipped to you by a FedEx or UPS is user-friendly enough that you can have really no prior experience with it, open the box, set it up, and start improving your compliance. I think that's a big, I hesitate to use the cliche of game changer, but that's really a big step forward. I think the other thing is the technology platforms that unify your data, they're much more accessible now, right? A lot of providers are able to develop their own sort of platforms that do this. You also have the ability to, if you want to buy into something yourself, there's these software as a service products that you can buy into relatively easily that let you do that sort of thing. So the accessibility, I think, has generally come down, right? Think about how much a flat screen TV cost 10 years ago, how much it costs now. Sort of the same thing for these higher technology solutions. They've just become a lot more accessible.
That's interesting, and I almost feel like if it's becoming more accessible, then it also becomes more the approach, right? How should safety leaders think about technology as an enabler rather than just a solution? Is it the end or is it the means to an end?
Yeah.
What's the mindset here?
Look, we talk about this all the time internally. As well as we talk about our services. It's a double-edged sword, right? You've got all of these easy-to-get technology solutions. It's very easy to put the cart before the horse and say, I need a technology solution for this, I need a technology solution for that. And now you've got a patchwork of things that don't really work well together. I think it really starts with, you need to define what you want your program and processes to be. And then that helps you understand, okay, now what technology do I need to implement to support those, right? the programs and processes are the key. That's the thing to start with. And then you figure out, how do I need to shore these up with technology to let me execute them efficiently?
Okay. All right. And then here's a question, and that is what capabilities should I expect the technology that I'm using to provide in a modern occupational health program?
Yeah, I think I can hit a couple, and then Mike, I'd be interested to know from your perspective what clients are expecting. So, one, I think from a technology solution is if it's around testing, it should be self-service, right? It should be intuitive enough to use that I don't need to put someone through a ton of training in order for them to do it, right? I talk my book just a little bit, right? That's something that we set out to do with Salix. Is occupational hearing testing is a daunting proposition for someone who's never done it before. There's equipment you need to keep calibrated. There's all these things about room noise. There's paperwork, and it's not just the test, it's the training, making sure people know how to put in their earplugs. Whatever solution you fit or you find, if it really fits your needs, I think you should be able to take that and hand it to someone with really little or no experience on sort of the clinical side of administering this stuff, and they should be able to do it, right? On the platform side of things, I think you need to look at good integration, right? If you have an electronic health record system, is this other solution that I'm looking for, does it integrate well, right? If I start testing people at clinics, are they able to plug in with the clinics so I can get this data back from the clinics and it flows into the same place as my mobile data or my on-demand data? I think those are the two big things that I'd look for. Mike, I don't know what your thoughts are.
Yeah, and to kind of continue on that conversation of integration, that's probably one of the number one things I hear on a regular basis. And it's not even just the integration of the data through whatever delivery methods, your provider might provide you, but how do you integrate even with, their HR system, whether they're running things like Workday or SAP or, Oracle. One of the things that companies are really thriving for is reduction of data entry, and these are the things that through integration into that side of technology has been a main focus with a lot of client companies, is getting that done. So I think that the more that this is becoming a norm in our industry segment and people are creating these integrations and being able to do the API links and everything that goes along with it, it's really taken a burden off of the client companies, which is really important too, because it's making it very much ease of transferring, protected information, that they need to keep secure between two entities. So I think that's the one thing. The other thing that we're seeing, which is really, I think, a unique aspect too, and some data platforms already have it, a lot of them are going to it, is companies are looking at it within their partner as they have their data. How can they segregate their data so safety can see this data, HR can see this data, operations can see this data, and that way all the data is still housed, but there's permission levels, which means it becomes a very useful tool to those employers as well, and they're not dealing with paperwork internally. They know that the second shift supervisor at this location can see the duty status report for an injured employee. And if they have restrictions on, they know exactly which of their essential functions they can and can't do. You start getting into that aspect, now you're changing how business is operated around your workers' comp and OccuMed program.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Mike, Matt, I hate to say it, but our time's up. Everybody, remember in the next day or two, we're going to be emailing you a link to an archived version of this webinar so that you can go and view it again or share it with a coworker. Before I sign off, I want to give a few notes of thanks. First off, I want to thank our experts today, Mike Pels, Vice President of Health and Safety Solutions at Examinetics, and Matt Kafer, Direction of Technology Development at Examinetics. Mike, Matt, that was a really fascinating little discussion here, and I got people saying, hey, that was great information. Gotta appreciate you guys taking the time.
Yeah, it was great.
We appreciate it.
Enjoyed it.
That was fun. All right. Okay, everybody, one last time, thanks to our sponsors for today's webinar, Examinetics. They're the ones who made today's webinar presentation possible, so make sure to go check them out. Last but not least, thanks to everybody out in the audience who participated with us and asked questions and listened in. You guys are all the reason that we do this, so thanks very much for your interest and involvement. Okay, we're going to sign off. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week, but for now, goodbye until the next occupational health and safety webinar.
Thank you.